I was back on that street again, one of the quietest to drive, but at this time of night, anywhere could be the end of the world. I was beginning to feel the weight of night. The darkness was heavy, as if the whole neighborhood was silent, waiting for something to happen. I'm an Uber driver, and that's how I make a living. But there is something about this city that makes me feel uncomfortable every time I work late. Always think about who may be getting into my car, what stories they carry, if I'm going to get into something that I shouldn't. I've seen everything, but that night, there was something in the air that made me feel like something was about to happen. The race called me to a neighborhood I used to avoid. I knew what people were talking about that place, robberies, trafficking, shootings, but I was out of options. The app was vibrating every minute and, well, I needed money. I took a deep breath and followed it to the address. When I arrived, there was no one on the sidewalk, only the sound of a dog in the distance and the dim lights of the poles. Then he appeared. The guy got into my car with the speed of someone who was running from something. Not like the other passengers, who came in with that look of just coming home after a long night's work. He seemed to be nervous. His gaze moved everywhere, as if he was being watched, as if the world around him were an imminent threat. He gave me a quick good night and closed the door harder than usual. I stood still, waiting for him to tell me the destination. When he spoke, his voice was low, but I noticed the tension. Take me to the downtown neighborhood. Quick. I did what he asked and stepped on the gas. The silence in the car was broken only by the sound of the engine and the breath of the passenger, which seemed heavier than it should. But what really caught my eye was when he started looking in the rearview mirror. Not once or twice, but constantly. It was as if I was looking for something or someone. I tried to ignore, but the weight of that restlessness was taking over me. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to break the tense mood. He looked at me for a second, eyes wide. "Yes, I just don't like being followed. I've been through this before." Kept going, trying to keep calm. It was just another run, right? I was just taking someone to their destination like I always did. But something was wrong. Something was out of place, and I didn't know what it was. But the feeling was there, growing with every mile. The truth is that at that moment I did not know yet, but I was about to be dragged into something much bigger than a simple race. That feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me for a second. The guy in the passenger seat, he was panicking, and every movement he made seemed more like a reflection of fear. He could not settle down, moved all the time in his hands, looked in the rearview mirror to the window as if trying to run away from something that he could not see. He spoke again, but this time his voice was more tense, more rushed. "Dude, take me quick, please. They're after me. I know they are." Those words hit me with a shock that made me accelerate without thinking. A shiver ran through my spine. Not that I had not caught nervous passengers before, people who were running from something or someone, but the way he spoke, the way the fear flowed of every word, left me without knowing what to do. How someone so desperate? What was happening? "Who's after you?" I asked, trying to keep calm. It was a reflection of me. I always tried to keep the tranquility, but inside me, something was changing. Didn't know if I was dealing with someone who was just crazy or if there really was something or someone chasing them. He took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in his voice. "They are dangerous. I can't explain it right, but they won't leave me alone. I need you to take me downtown, quick." No stopping. That's when I noticed something was really wrong. Car, a dark sedan, was right behind us. Was following us for a few minutes, but I had not paid much attention until now. The problem was that the car seemed to be at exactly the same distance on all streets at intersections. Always the same distance, without changing, as if he was waiting for a right time to approach. I took a look at the passenger. He was no longer looking at me, but at the window with his eyes fixed, as if he were waiting for the persecution to finally reach him. He bit his lips, the eyes lacriming with tension. "You noticed, right?" he whispered, as if he had read my thoughts. "They're after me. The car can't catch us." I tried to change the subject, trying to stay rational. "It's just a car. It'll be fine, I'll take you downtown. Rest easy." But I was not quiet. I was not at all quiet. When I looked again in the rearview mirror, I saw that the dark car had decreased the distance. Now I was a few meters away from us. A warning signal sounded inside me. The instinct for survival, perhaps. I could smell the danger in the air, and the tension in the car was swallowing me up. Please speed up, faster. They know where I am. They'll get me. I don't know what to do, said the passenger, his voice almost in a whisper, as if he didn't want to be heard. I took a quick look at the street ahead. No clear escape option, no place where I could hide. The neighborhood was empty, the streets deserted. There was no one around. I was completely alone with that guy and the car that followed us. When the traffic signal turned red, I did not stop. I passed through the light, without thinking, only the sound of the engine and the cry of adrenaline inside me. The car behind us followed the same movement, without hesitation. It was hunting us. Who are they? What did you do? I asked, trying to understand, but he just looked at me with a deep fear in his eyes, as if his life was being dragged into a bottomless pit. I don't know who they are, but they won't stop. They won't stop. The fear now was not only his, it was mine too. I was in this story now, and there was no turning back. The engine of my car roared, cutting off the quiet night, but it didn't seem fast enough. Every time I looked in the rear-view mirror, the car behind was closer. The headlights cut through the darkness like sharp blades, and I could feel the weight of each second. The heart was beating hard in my chest, almost as if it was pressing me to accelerate more, go faster, do something. But what could I do? Where could I go? They're getting closer, you see? They'll get us. The passenger was desperate now. He screamed, and his voice tore the silence of the car, cutting off the tension with a cry of sheer fright. Please take me somewhere. Take me somewhere safe. I was sweating cold, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Fear was taking hold of me, and I knew that if I did not do something soon, we would not get out alive. I wanted to ask more, understand what was happening, but every time I looked in the rear-view mirror, I saw that car that did not stop approaching, as if it was destined to reach us, as if there is no escape. When we turned a corner, the car behind us made the same move, gluing even more. They were surrounding us, swallowing us. I drove down a narrower street, trying to lose the car persecutor, but he did not stop. The tires of my car sang in the corners, and the fear tightened more and more, like a pressure on the chest. That's when the truth finally started to form. I was in a race against something much bigger than me. The dark car that followed us, the terrified eyes of the passenger. Everything was starting to make sense, but the sense was more terrifying than I could have imagined. They're after me because I'm the target. I saw something I shouldn't have seen. Now they're after me. They won't stop, no matter what I do. I didn't know what he was saying. I didn't want to believe it. But his fear, the despair in his voice, were dragging me into the story without a way out. I was being pulled into an abyss, and there was no turning back. The car that was chasing us was now so close that I could hear the engine roar, the smell of burning rubber, and the lights obscured my view. They were about to catch up with us, and I had no idea what to do. I couldn't let this guy die in front of me. I didn't know what he had done, but he was asking for help, and I couldn't just abandon someone like that. Suddenly, an absurd idea crossed my mind. An alley on the left, a narrow place where I could maybe turn around and lose the car. The alley looked like a last attempt, but it was the only thing I could do. The driver of the other car certainly couldn't follow. Steady hold, I cried, pulling the steering wheel to the left without looking straight. The passenger clung to the seat, almost falling from so much panic. The chasing car did not hesitate, also turned the corner, following us with an almost supernatural determination. Every turn seemed like a chance to save us, but they were there, behind, all the time. My mind was in a whirlwind, and I didn't even know where I was going anymore. The only thing I felt was the sound of the engine roaring, the tires singing, and my chest squeezing every second. I was being dragged into something that I didn't understand, and at that moment I realized it didn't matter what I did. The car behind us had already become something more than just a chase. They were ready to take me, ready to pull me down with the passenger. And all I could do was try to escape, even though there might be nowhere to go. I turned another corner, and the car that was following us was now so close that I could almost feel the driver's breath. The alley was ahead, narrow and dark, and I felt like I was going straight into an abyss. I had no choice, no time. Whatever that pursuit was, it seemed they were willing to catch up with us at any cost. "Please accelerate." The passenger was in panic, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, seeing the car approaching. "They'll get us, it'll be the end." I didn't know what else to do. Every second was an eternity, and I just knew that I had to run. My fingers were pressed on the steering wheel, and sweat ran down my forehead. I was already so far from home, so out of control, that the feeling of despair almost made me lose the direction. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let that be the end. When I walked into the alley, the sound of tires cutting the asphalt echoed in my brain, and I knew that I could not lose the car behind us. The alley was too narrow, the curve too tight. The car that was chasing me passed by me, and I felt a shiver of relief, believing that I had finally managed to escape. But the relief lasted only a short time. Suddenly, a strong light appeared in front of me. It was not the car headlamp behind us, but a light coming from the end of the alley. I accelerated, but the more I sped up, the more the light seemed to be coming closer. And then, the next moment, everything went dark. The car stopped with a jolt, and the sound of the engine turning off was like a blow to my stomach. I looked to the side, but the passenger was no longer there. He had simply disappeared. I didn't know what was going on. That alley had no way out. How did it disappear so quickly? The car that was chasing me now was empty, stopped, with no sign of life. Everything was in absolute silence, and the only thing left was the sound of my heavy breathing and the cold in my spine. I sat there in the car for a long time, trying to process what had happened. The streets were deserted, and the surrounding city seemed to have been swallowed up by night. There were no more cars, no more movement, only emptiness. I looked once more in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a skeletal figure of a man standing behind the car. But there was no one there when I looked for the last time. The fear took me completely, and without thinking, I started with the car. But as I drove through the night, a question hovered in my mind. Who was that man? And more importantly, what really happened that night? I never saw the passenger again, but somewhere, in my mind, I knew it wasn't over. Not for me, not for him. The last thing I remember was feeling like the chase would never really end. And when I looked in the rearview mirror once more, I realized that maybe I was no longer alone. The dark city around me seemed to watch, waiting. The night routine always had its charm and its risks. Driving as an app driver was never my dream, but it paid the bills and gave me some freedom. Over time, I learned to read people. You can see just by looking at it who will be polite, who will complain about everything, and who will simply get in the car, put on the headphones, and pretend that you do not exist. It was common to get ratings right after the races. The 5 stars were my pride, not only for the bonus, but for recognition. So when I started noticing some races that ended without any evaluation, I was intrigued. The first time, I thought it was carelessness. On the second, I didn't give it much importance. But when it started happening often, something bothered me. It was strange. On a particularly calm night, I accepted a race that seemed normal. A starting point in a residential neighborhood and a destination not far away, in the center. The passenger appeared quickly, which is always good. He was a man of ordinary appearance, perhaps a little more serious than usual, but nothing that caught my attention. He got into the car, greeted with a brief nod, and sat in the back seat. "Good night, all right?" I asked, as I always do. He replied with an almost inaudible murmur, and soon lost himself looking out of the window. It seemed the typical passenger who did not want to talk, and I would not insist. I turned on the radio quietly and followed the path indicated by the application. It was only when we were at the 3rd traffic light that he broke the silence. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, his voice calm, almost casual, but with something I could not identify immediately. I looked in the rearview mirror, trying to decipher it. It was a strange question, but maybe it was just curiosity. Not exactly. I work here, but I live on the other side of town, I replied, trying to keep it light. He nodded as if recording the information. The next question came so fast that it caught me unawares. Do you live alone? The air in the car seemed to weigh. An alarm went off in my head, but I tried not to show it. With my family, I lied as naturally as I could. He paused again, looking out the window. But now I could feel the weight of his gaze returning to me from time to time, as if he wanted to study me. Tried to ignore it. It must have been just some weirdo, tired from a long day. At least that's what I was trying to convince myself. The destination was not far away, so soon he would be out of my car, and I would forget everything. But one thing was certain. This race would not be forgotten so easily. The discomfort did not go away. On the contrary, it seemed to grow every minute. Even with the radio playing low, his silence was deafening. I could feel his look in the rearview mirror, even when he tried not to look back. When there were less than 5 minutes to reach the destination, he asked again, "Do you like what you do?" The question caught me by surprise, but I forced a smile. It's quiet. Not the job of your dreams, but you can pay the bills. He laughed softly, almost as if he found my answer amusing. It was a short but cold laugh, without a hint of true humor. What about your passengers? He continued. Have you ever had a problem? I tried to laugh to relieve tension. Some, but nothing serious. Just people complaining about music or air conditioning. Normal. He was silent for a while, staring at the window, but seemed to be thinking of something. Suddenly he leaned forward, speaking low but with an intensity that made me shudder. What would you do if I was different? I swallowed dry. My instinct told me that this race was wrong, but at the same time, my logic tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was just a lonely, socially awkward guy trying to make conversation. Or maybe it was something worse. How so different? I asked, trying to keep the voice steady, but without hiding the tip of restlessness. He smiled in a strange way, leaning back on the bench. Nothing. Forget it. I thought of asking something else, but something told me not to insist. When the GPS indicated that we were near our destination, I felt a relief. The place was a shopping area in the center, where there is always movement, even at night. I thought I was about to get rid of that strange situation. But then he said something that made me cold. Let's make a stop first. You can turn right here. I looked at the application, confused. The final destination was clear, and there was no change request. But the destination is there ahead, I argued. I know, he replied, steady. I just want to show you something. My heart was racing. Every fiber of my being shouted that I should not follow the instructions, but my mind tried to rationalize. Maybe he forgot to add the stop in the app, or maybe it was just someone harmless wanting a favor. Even so, I hesitated. Look, man, if you want to change the route, you have to adjust in the app. I can't divert without authorization. He didn't answer. He just stood still, looking at me in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought he would insist, but then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible smile. All right, continue then. I knew I should be relieved, but that smile left something even more unsettling in the air. I continued driving, but my eyes were now attentive to every detail. The deserted streets, the failing light poles, the strange silence of the night. When the GPS indicated that we had arrived, I thought I could finally breathe. The site was more remote than I imagined, with only a few abandoned buildings and vacant lots around. You can stop here, he said, pointing to a dark alley. A knot formed in my stomach. The place seemed anything but safe. Here? Are you sure? I asked, hoping he would say something like, I was wrong. It's up ahead. But he just nodded, slowly opening the car door. Yes, here it is perfect. I should have left at that moment, but I didn't. Something in the way he got out of the car made me wait, as if I was stuck there by pure curiosity or fear. That's when I noticed he wasn't alone. There were other people waiting at the end of the alley, their silhouettes barely lit by the few light poles. They did not move, just watched, motionless, as if they were waiting for me. The air in the car was thick, and a shiver ran through my spine. I knew something was very wrong, but I could not move a muscle. My body was trapped, as if it had been hypnotized by the figures in the distance. The man behind me, the passenger, got out of the car without any hurry, as if he already knew I would have nowhere to run. He took some steps in the direction of the silhouettes, which remained motionless, as if awaiting his arrival. I could not take their eyes. The shadows did not move, but something in them was alive. I could feel, without even seeing clearly their faces, something heavy, as if their presence was pressing the environment, making the air even more difficult to breathe. Trying to ignore the growing fear, I started the car, hoping that the engine would start at once. But nothing, just the muffled sound of the engine trying and failing to catch. Panic started to rise. I turned the key again, harder, without success. I looked at the dashboard. The engine light was on, but nothing happened. The car didn't respond. Desperate, I hit my hands on the wheel and tried again. Stronger, faster, but the car did not turn. The sound of the engine failure now seemed an echo, spreading through the quietness of the night. When I looked in the rear-view mirror, the man who was behind me was no longer there. He was near the silhouettes, walking towards them as if it were part of the plan. And somehow, I knew that these figures were not just people waiting for someone. They were watching me. Sweat began to run down my forehead. I looked aside. The alley was completely deserted, except for the shadows. Without another thought, I tried to open the door to get out of the car, but it was locked. My hand trembled as I pressed the handle, useless. The others in the corner did not move, but there was something about them that made me feel like they were waiting for a sign. Or maybe waiting for me to make the first move. It was when a soft voice, but full of a threatening tone, came from behind. "Do you think you can get out?" It was the man. He had approached so quietly that I did not notice. My vision was blurred for a second, and before I could answer he said more. "They are waiting for us. No point in running." Those words stuck with me. What did he mean by they? Who were the figures in front of me? What was going on there? I was stuck in something that I did not understand, something that was beyond any rational explanation. My instinct finally cried. I needed to get out of there. The door was locked, but the window, the driver's window, I looked at her and with my sweaty hands, I tried to open. The pressure was increasing in my chest, but I managed to slowly pull down the window. I was so close to freedom, but before I could put my foot out, I heard the sound of the footsteps coming closer, steady, synchronized, as if all the beings around were moving at the same time. I looked forward, and there they were, now closer. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were partially illuminated by the dim light of the poles. They were not ordinary people. They were nothing I had seen before. The man next to me stepped back, and then the darkness seemed to swallow the alley. The shadows were moving, and I knew there was no escape. I was surrounded. I was surrounded, not by people but by something else. Something that I could not understand, but felt with a bewildering clarity. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that made me breathe short and panting. The alley was empty, but there was no more loneliness. I could hear the footsteps approaching, a dragged echo that seemed to make the earth shake. The man who accompanied me, the passenger, was now standing beside my car, looking at me with a smile that I could not decipher. His eyes shone in the dim light, and I suddenly realized that they were not human eyes. "No more. They are waiting for you," he said again, but his voice didn't sound like it used to. Now she was lower, more drawn. I wanted to scream. I wanted to do anything to get rid of that feeling of being stuck. of being watched by forces beyond my comprehension. But my body was panicking, and I couldn't move. The car was dead, the doors locked, and the window opened just enough to show the figure approaching me. On the other side of the alley, the shadows began to move faster. They were no longer static. They were like faces, blobs of a nightmare, emerging from places where there was nothing before. Each movement they made seemed to pull me into a dark place, where there was no return. It was then that I saw something that froze me completely. Among the shadows, more figures appeared, more men and women, all with grotesquely distorted faces, their eyes empty and fixed on me. The heat of panic took hold of me, and for a moment, I forgot everything. I forgot what was happening. I forgot who I was, and I only knew one thing. I needed to leave. It was when, with my hands shaking, I hit the car dashboard again, as if that would somehow change everything. But nothing happened. I was stuck. I knew I was stuck. The man next to me looked at me with a slight expression of disdain. "They will evaluate you," he said with an unflappable calm. "And you'll be one of us. There's no more escape." I tried to look around, and when my eyes went through them, what I saw made me lose any hope that I had. They were not just more people. They were shadows, grotesque imitations of what was once human. I didn't know how they had come about or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. I was stuck in some kind of game, and it wasn't me who had the cards. The sound of the man beside me laughing, soft and cold, cut the silence. He was enjoying my despair. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but the shadows gave me no choice. My body was paralyzed, and all I could do was wait for the final evaluation. And then, just as the shadows were about to surround me completely, a strong light suddenly appeared, blinding my eyes. I tried to look at the source of light, but the intensity was unbearable. When the light went out, all that remained was darkness. I don't know what happened next. When I woke up, I was back in my car, the key still on the ignition. The engine was running normally. The running app was open on my screen, but there was no new evaluation, as if nothing had happened. No race, no passenger, no shadow. I'm still wondering if all that was real, if it was a nightmare or something, or someone was really testing me. I don't know, but since that night, no reviews appeared on my app. Never again. And no matter how hard I try, I can never get rid of the feeling that I am being watched, that they are still waiting. Dawn has always been my favorite time to drive. The city, which during the day seemed an uncontrolled anthill, became almost silent, as if it was taking a long sigh. The empty streets, lit only by sparse poles, had a kind of peace that I could not find anywhere else. That night, I was parked at a gas station, finishing a coffee to keep me awake. The clock on the dashboard was 1:37. The night was colder than usual, and the fog created strange shadows around the cars. The cell phone vibrated in the support, taking me out of my numbness. It was a new race. The starting point seemed to be in a remote area, a place I did not recognize immediately. An address on the edge of a side road, without much detail. For a second, I considered rejecting. Those races in remote places never brought me good memories. But the fare was high and I needed the money. It'll be quick, I thought to myself, accepting the race while starting the car. The way to the place was strange from the beginning. The music that always accompanied me seemed out of place, so I turned off the radio. The road was increasingly dark and deserted, and the tall trees on both sides seemed to bend over me, forming a suffocating tunnel. A shiver ran through my spine, but I shook my head to ward off the discomfort. "It's just my head playing tricks," I muttered, trying to convince myself. When I finally arrived at the meeting point, I slowed down and turned on the flashing light. GPS indicated that I was in the right place, but there was no one in sight. The place seemed forgotten by God. An empty road, with a single lamp flashing in the distance, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. I looked at the clock again and decided to wait. Maybe the passenger was late, but when I started to consider giving up and cancel the race, the back door of the car opened suddenly. I was scared and turned back. A man got into the car without saying a word. He didn't even say hi, just closed the door and typed the destination in the app. "Good night," I tried to say, but my voice came out low, almost choked. He didn't even look at me. He stood there, with his eyes fixed on the window, staring at nothing. The silence inside the car was suffocating, and for some reason I started to feel a strange weight in my chest. Something in that situation did not seem right, but I could not explain exactly what. I continued driving in silence, trying to ignore the growing discomfort that was settling inside the car. The road seemed endless, and the darkness around us seemed thicker than usual. The sound of tires on the asphalt and the motor's roar were the only noises that broke that oppressive silence. From time to time, I looked in the rear-view mirror, trying to understand who was that passenger. He seemed normal at first sight. A man in a dark suit, short hair, and well-groomed. But there was something about him that bothered me. He was very quiet, too still. He looked like a statue, with his eyes fixed on the outside of the window, as if he was looking at something only he could see. "So, are you coming home from work?" I asked, trying to pick up the subject. My voice echoed in the silence of the car, sounding louder than I intended. No answer. He didn't even move his head. Forcing a smile to ease the tension, I continued, "Or maybe you're going home after a party. Working at night has its advantages, but I always feel disconnected from people." Again, nothing. Just his reflection in the window glass, motionless, staring at the darkness outside. My restlessness increased with every mile. I began to notice things that seemed strange. The air inside the car seemed colder than outside, even with the heating on. There was a strange smell too, something I could not identify but that reminded me of wet metal. To distract me, I decided to check the path in the GPS. The route showed that there were only 5 minutes left to the destination. I sighed, relieved. Soon that would be over. But then I noticed something in the rearview mirror. For a moment, it seemed that the reflection of the passenger was out of sync with the movement of the car. As if he did not move with me. I winked and looked again, but everything seemed normal. "It's just fatigue," I thought, trying to convince myself. The silence was still unbearable. I tried to put a song to disguise it, but the radio only emitted static. I patted the panel, but the sound didn't come back. It was as if the radio had just stopped working. "Great," I muttered, looking through the rearview mirror once more. The man stood there impassive, as if nothing had happened. When I finally saw the lights of what seemed to be fate, a relief took hold of me. I parked the car and, turning to the back seat, announced, "We have arrived." But the bank was empty. My heart froze. I blinked several times, staring at the empty bench. He was there, I was sure. Even the sound of the door closing when he entered still echoed in my mind. "That doesn't make sense," I murmured to myself, turning my body over to look better. The leather seat was intact, with no sign of anyone sitting there. I checked the floor, the doors, even the trunk passed through my head, but it was impossible. He just disappeared. I tried to keep calm, although my trembling fingers said otherwise. I took my phone to check the application, hoping to understand what was happening. When I opened the race history, I was even more confused. The race had been canceled. And worse, the cancellation was registered even before I arrived at the meeting point. "It can't be," I whispered, feeling the cold sweat run down my neck. Something was wrong, very wrong. I closed the application and looked at the clock on the dashboard. What seemed to have been a journey of 20 minutes showed that it had lasted less than 10. The time did not beat. I was beginning to think that I had completely lost track of things. Take a deep breath, trying to regain control. I decided to get out of the car to check the place. It was a deserted street with spaced houses and lights off. The silence outside was even heavier, almost tangible. Every step of mine echoed like thunder. Suddenly, I heard something. It was a whisper, low, coming from somewhere nearby. I turned my head around, trying to locate the source, but there was no one. The whisper increased, now lighter. It sounded like my name. Ethan, My body froze. The voice was low, drawn, but clear enough to make me believe that I was not alone. Instinctively, I ran back to the car, slamming the door hard, turned on the engine and accelerated without even looking back. Everything inside me said to get out of there as soon as possible. The street lights passed like a conspicuous, and the silence of the car was now cut only by my heavy breathing. But as I drove, I couldn't resist and looked in the mirror one last time. For a moment, I swear I saw something. The silhouette of someone in the back seat, staring at me with empty eyes. When I turned to look for real, there was no one there. I arrived home with my hands still shaking, heart pounding in the chest. Went up the stairs hurried, locking the door behind me as if something was chasing me. I leaned against the wall of the room, trying to calm my breath. What was that? I asked aloud, but the only answer was the oppressive silence of my little apartment. I threw the phone on the couch and sat down, trying to organize my thoughts. I turned the app back on, reviewing the race, looking for anything that explained what had happened. But the data was still there. The race canceled, the time distorted, and the starting address, a place I never wanted to visit again. With each passing second, the feeling that something had followed me became stronger. Paranoia took hold of me, and my eyes popped into every shadow in the room. The television turned off reflected my image, and for a moment I had the impression that there was someone else beside me. I turned my head quickly, but of course there was no one. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every noise, the sound of the wind, the buildings squeaking seemed amplified, as if something was moving around me. Finally, I got up and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands buried in my face. The following days were even worse. I continued working, but never again accepted races to remote areas. Whenever I stopped somewhere at night, I felt as if I was being watched. Sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I saw a silhouette in the back seat, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. The following week, something happened that made me even more upset. I received a notification from the app. It was an evaluation. The comment said, "Smooth ride. I got there well. Thank you." I stared at the screen, hands sweating while holding the phone. The evaluation was signed with a name, John S., the same name that appeared in the race that night. I tried to open the passenger profile, but it no longer existed in the system. Since then, I avoid driving at night. But even now, months later, I still feel that he never left the car. Some nights, when I park and look in the rearview mirror, I can swear that I see a figure sitting there watching me.